He was sold as a boy and returned as a king. He built a city on the edge of the mangroves, set tolls on the rivers, and made the world's saw and machinery run slick with palm oil. Then, one afternoon, a British consul invited him aboard a gunboat to talk. He never came home. This is the full story of King Jaja of Opobo, told straight with what we know from records. And where the record is thin, I'll tell you that too. Start with the river. In the 19th century, the Niger Delta was a maze of creeks and tides, a marketplace more than a map. The old economy, selling captives to the Atlantic world, was collapsing under abolitionist pressure and naval patrols. In its place, a new trade surged: palm oil. Europe needed it for soap, candles, and as lubricant for factories. Inland, farmers tapped palm groves and boiled kernels. Downriver, great canoe houses, commercial kinship organizations organized fleets, credit, and protection. At their ports, they took kome, the customs that kept their polities running. Into that system, sometime around the 1820s, a boy entered the Delta against his will. Most traditions in southeastern Nigeria say he was born in Banaso Okwarao Zurumba, in Amaigbo, among the Igbo. That part of his life comes to us primarily from oral memory collected later by local historians. British paperwork begins only after he reached the coast. In Bonny, a powerhouse of the Ibani people, the boy received a new name in a new language, Jubo Juboga. Europeans would mangle it as Jaja, and that is the name the records use. Bonny's canoe houses were not just families, they were firms with flags, fleets, and clients, run by house heads who could be as wealthy as any prince. A person who entered a house in bondage could, with time and proved loyalty, rise to management and even freedom. Jubo learned fast. He learned the language of trust and debt, the rhythms of the tide, and the ledgers that tracked advances and repayments. Muskets, cloth and spirits out, barrels of palm oil back. He distinguished himself in the Ana People faction, one of Bonny's two great blocks, and eventually became a house head himself. When British traders wrote to Liverpool about Jaja, they meant a man they did business with, fluent in negotiation, strict on contracts, and very clear about who controlled which waterway. The British sources are rich from here on. Consular dispatches, the blue books of parliamentary papers, and the correspondence of Liverpool firms mention Bonny's politics constantly because the stability of the river meant profit. Those papers describe two rival coalitions, Ana People and Manila People, vying for control after Bonny's old dynastic framework faltered. The Manila People side's most forceful figure in the 1860s was Oko Jumbo. The Ana People side star was Jaja. Missionary journals from the Church Missionary Society's Niger Mission, working in the Delta in those years, had outside eyes. Chiefs wrestling for influence, houses enforcing debt, missionaries wanting schools and churches, traders wanting access. To understand the conflict, understand the trust system. Inland producers did not just show up with oil, they received advances, cloth, metal, salt, sometimes guns from coastal houses, and were bound to repay in oil at an agreed price. The house guaranteed peace along the route, settled disputes, and bore the risk. European firms at the coast dealt with the house, not the farmer. The house in turn charged kome on all that moved through its port. If that system broke, the house broke. Jaja knew this to his bones. He restricted the flood of gin into his domains, not out of Puritanism alone, but because drunken crews sink canoes and miss deliveries. He insisted on set points of exchange. He blocked what he saw as smuggling when foreign captains tried to sail past the port to trade upriver. In his view, this was law and custom. In British free trade rhetoric, it was a monopoly. Bonny slid toward war. By 1869, the rivalry between the two blocks was not just words, it was burned compounds, seized canoes, and disrupted commerce. Motivations and alliances are a knot in the sources here. British firms and consuls tried to steady the river and their profits, sometimes backing one side, then the other, depending on who promised open trade. What is clear is what Jaja did next. He took people loyal to him, war canoe houses, clients, families, and he founded a new city-state at a strategic choke point near the mouth of the Imo River. He named it Opobo. He took the title Amanyanabo, king. Why there? Look at the map of the Eastern Delta routes. The Imo River feeds the trade from the Igbo hinterland. A settlement at its mouth is a gatehouse. From Opobo, Jaja could redirect the flow that once made Bonny rich. That was the point. Within a short time, British consular reports and Liverpool letters agree on this. Opobo drew much of the eastern trade. European firms followed the oil. When they tried to push past and deal directly upriver, Jaja stopped them, fined them, or sent them back. He framed it as the enforcement of established custom. They called it obstruction. The argument for a while made both sides money. Inside Opobo, Jaja worked like a merchant general. Accounts from missionaries who received land and protection to build schools and chapels describe a ruler keen on order, punctuality, and reputation. Inland communities who had dealt with him in the Bonny years kept dealing with him. Trust is portable when it is enforced. House courts handled debts. Patrols kept the creeks secure. He took kome on goods entering and leaving, including on palm kernels and oil. He balanced traditional authority with modern tools, a court day that ran to a schedule, a ledger as sacred as a treaty. But treaties were coming. In Europe, the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85 formalized what was already happening on the ground: claims, spheres, and protectorates. On the Niger coast, British consuls spread printed agreements promising protection and, crucially, freedom of trade. One of those consuls, J.F. Hewitt, did the rounds in 1884, collecting signatures and marks. British parliamentary papers from the period summarize these treaties and list parties. Jaja and his chiefs appear in the British view as consenting to protection under the crown. Local memory and later Nigerian scholarship often stress that whatever was signed, Jaja believed his internal sovereignty, including control of Kome and river passage, remained intact. If you read the British side, freedom of trade meant no one, no king, no house, could stop their firms from steaming upriver to buy oil directly. If you listen to Opobo and Bonny voices, mainly through later recorded oral histories and missionary accounts, the understanding was that established customs stood unless specifically renegotiated. Those two readings were on a collision course. The former declaration of the Oil Rivers Protectorate in 1885 put a new skin on that old argument. The British Consul's office, now backed by Protectorate authority and occasional Royal Navy muscle, took complaints from European firms as cause for intervention. Reports from Liverpool merchants, some still quoted in Chamber of Commerce minutes, accused Jaja of expelling agents, levying unfair fines, and closing the river. Jaja's side of the paper trail is thinner because it is scattered. Petitions and letters he or his scribes sent to the consul and to higher authorities, insisting that he was upholding custom, maintaining order, and protecting his state's revenue. They exist because British offices acknowledged and summarized them. When you read the consular dispatches in the blue books, you can hear his arguments through the official paraphrase. This was also a fight over what law meant. British officials increasingly treated the protectorate treaties as authorizing them to define the rules. Jaja pointed to his own courts, his oaths with inland communities, and long-standing practice. Even when he accommodated, allowing missionaries, permitting some direct shipment to Europe under his seal, negotiating standardized rates, he would not concede open upriver access. He was not alone. Across the Delta, other polities tried to hold the middleman system together, but Jaja was the most visible ruler doing it, and Opobo was the most successful city making it pay. Then came 1807. The name you meet in the British record is Consul Harry Henry Hamilton Johnston. The basic sequence is not in dispute because the consul reported it himself and London printed it. A British warship anchored off Opobo. The consul invited Jaja aboard to discuss outstanding issues. Jaja went. Accounts diverge on the promises made. Opobo tradition and a stream of later Nigerian writing say Jaja went under assurance of safe conduct. Johnston's dispatches do not record that. They record rather that once aboard, he confronted Jaja and placed him under arrest for obstructing trade and violating protectorate policy. British newspapers summarized the affair with the bland certainty of empire. The consul had acted to uphold treaty rights and free commerce. Jaja was taken from his river. He was transported under British guard, held on the coast, and then, as the papers say, tried before a colonial court in the Gold Coast. The proceedings appear in colonial administrative records and in summaries in parliamentary papers. The detailed transcript is harder to track, but the outcomes are clear in official summaries. The verdict went the way the protectorate wanted. Jaja was fined and, more devastatingly, banished from his own state. He would receive a stipend, he would live under British supervision overseas, and he would not be permitted to return to Opobo without government approval. His place of exile is consistently given in British papers as the West Indies, St. Vincent, with a stipend but stripped of power. From afar, he kept writing petitions and letters to British authorities, demanding either a fair settlement or the right to return. Back home, Opobo's politics were reshaped under the protectorate. British firms established alternative ports to weaken his chokehold, and regional power realigned. Back home, the river went on. With Jaja in exile, the British dissolved the choke point he had built. They recognized alternative points of trade, encouraged firms to establish new factories upriver, and tightened the protectorate's grip. You can see this shift in the administrative maps. The Oil Rivers Protectorate, later renamed the Niger Coast Protectorate, and then folded into the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria. Bonny and Opobo adapted. The house system did not vanish overnight, but its leverage over European shipping weakened. In 1891, after years in exile and more petitions, British authorities relented partway. Permission was granted for Jaja to return to West Africa, crucially, not necessarily to resume rule in Opobo. He set out by steamer. The British newspapers that followed colonial affairs carried the final clipped notice. He fell ill and died at Tenerife in the Canary Islands. Officially, illness. Rumors of poisoning spread immediately and they live on in Nigerian memory and popular history. On that point, the archives are stubbornly unsatisfying. There's no conclusive proof either way. What is certain is that he never set foot again on the mudflats where his city rose. What kind of ruler was he? The records let you see him from several angles. To British free traders and their patrons, he was a monopolist who blocked progress, bullied rivals, and kept European firms from opening the river. In their papers, every fine he levied read like extortion. Every insistence on Kome read like tyranny. To missionaries, the ones that gained his leave to work in Opopo, he was a ruler who valued order, encouraged schooling, and limited the liquor that made their work harder. In Opopo and in much of the Delta, oral histories praise him as an organizer, a protector, and a king who claimed space for African authority in an age of encroaching gunboats. There's another angle that honest storytelling can't skip. Jaja rose through and profited from a system that had roots in unfreedom. The canoe houses that became palm oil corporations had grown fat in the age of the slave trade. When the Atlantic demand for slaves collapsed, they pivoted to oil. The houses still bound people to work through debt and status, and justice was swift and rough when obligations were broken. Jaja was severe with debtors and rivals. His genius was to channel that severity into a functioning port state that inland communities preferred to deal with, and that Europeans
had to respect. That's the man the documents show, not a saint, not a villain, but an extremely competent political economist who refused to let outsiders redefine the rules without a fight. His enemies were not always personal. Okojumbo and Boni had his own claims and his own alliances, sometimes with the very firms that denounced Jaja. King George Pepple, restored to Boni's throne after time abroad, navigated between factions and foreign powers, and his fortunes rose and fell with theirs. Seen through consular reports and Liverpool minutes, the Delta looks like a chessboard. Seen from Opobo's oral memory, it looks like home. If you want to follow the paper trail yourself, the primary sources people rightly ask for, here's where Jaja's century speaks in its own voice, and this is part of the story too. British consular dispatches from the Oil Rivers Protectorate in the mid-1880s, printed in House of Commons parliamentary papers, give the official view of the treaties, the trade disputes, and the 1807 arrest. Look for titles along the lines of Africa, Affairs of the Oil Rivers Protectorate, and Correspondence respecting the affairs of the Niger coast, and for the name of H. H. Johnston among the signatories to dispatches. In those same volumes, you'll find summaries of Jaja's petitions, his arguments refracted through the consul's paraphrase. Missionary letters and journals from the Church Missionary Society's Niger Mission add texture on Boni and Opobo. Schools opened with Jaja's consent, disputes settled with his intervention. The London Missionary Society and Wesleyan sources add regional context. Their writers were not neutral, but they watched. There are also the commercial records, Liverpool Chamber of Commerce reports, correspondence between firms and the consul, and testimony given to British inquiries about West African trade. They record European frustration with middlemen and demands for direct access upriver, with Opobo often cited by name. Naval records note visits to the Delta, ships stationed off the coast, and the presence of gunboats that made consular threats credible. Colonial administrative reports from the Gold Coast record the conduct and outcome of the legal proceedings against Jaja. British newspapers summarize both the arrest and the exile with confidence that their audience would approve. What you do not find in neat bundles are the documents that would tell his early life on his own terms. For those, you lean on later collections of Delta oral traditions and on the work of Nigerian historians who gathered them. The names of his Igbo kin, the route by which he was sold down river, the early favors he won as a clever boy in Boni. These are sources with different rules of truth than a consular dispatch, and they carry their own authority in the communities that kept them. A careful biography puts them side by side. This is what the British wrote to London. This is what people in Amaigbo say their grandparents said. This is where the two agree. This is where they diverge. Put it all together and Jaja's life looks like a test case for a bigger question. Who gets to decide how a river economy modernizes? He bet that a local sovereign, ruling through houses and courts, could negotiate with Europe from a position of strength, admitting change on his own terms. The British bet that treaties, plus steam, plus naval backing would pry the system open. Both bets were rational. One had an empire at its back. He died without a throne, and yet his name endures. Opobo remembers him as Jaja I, Amanyanabo. Nigerian schools put his story near the heart of a larger story, the making of a country out of protectorates and ports, treaties.
Resistance, statues, and place names carry him forward, and even his enemies' archives keep his shadow on the page.
He is the boy whose name changed with the tide, the merchant who timed the river, the king who tried to hold a line that history, in that moment, would not let him keep. If you listen closely, you can still hear their words about him, the consuls justifying, the merchants complaining, the missionaries negotiating, the people of Opobo remembering. That is the chorus of the primary record. And in the long wash of it, one figure stands at the mouth of a river, counting barrels, enforcing customs, and insisting, politely at first, then with all the power he could muster, that nothing moved without the king's say-so. History records his exile, not his return. But Opobo remembers him differently, not as a captive, but as a king who refused to trade his people's freedom for the empire's comfort. From the creeks to the classroom, his name still moves like the tide. Jaja, the boy who rose from chains to challenge the world, and who taught a nation that dignity can outlive any crown.